Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Levy. For those of you who don't know, I teach a course on a web platform called Udemy, which is one of the world's largest online course platforms. And it's through that platform and through being an instructor that I met my guest today. Dr. Anthony Metivier is an experienced author, consultant, and an expert in the field of memory and learning. Dr. Anthony is a fellow instructor on Udemy, and he's been a friend of mine since I originally appeared on his highly rated podcast, the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. Anthony's innovations in the field of mnemonics help him teach people all over the world how to exceed in academics, learning languages, memorizing poetry, and a whole host of other amazing skills. This podcast goes into a lot of different topics, and Anthony and I cover a lot of ground, from different mnemonics and memorization techniques all the way to meditation. So now I'm very excited to introduce you to Dr. Anthony Metivier. So Anthony, good evening. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for making the time. I had so much fun with you on your podcast, the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. It was one of the things that actually inspired me to do this show. And I want to thank you for that. I thought it'd be really fun to have you as one of our first guests. So welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And I know that my audience of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast really responded well to your interview. And I know it sent some people to your course, so it was fantastic.
It did, and thank you for that. And it was such a blast. And I think the audience picked up on that, you and I kind of having this mind meld. And we had a really good time. And I'm sure we're going to have a great time on this podcast as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people really respond to it too, because it's not really coming from Mensa or championship stuff. Nothing wrong with that, but it's just more down to earth and real application to our studies and so forth from people who use it for those purposes.
Definitely. And actually, you've been involved in memory and accelerated learning for a long time, before I was, and also before it became kind of a really trendy topic. Maybe share with our audience the story of how you got into this field.
Well, it was just happenstance, and a very lucky one, because I had been in graduate school in Toronto at York University, and these hard Toronto winters and something wrong with my biology sent me into a real bad depression, and I couldn't think and I couldn't concentrate, and I had the weight of all these exams on my shoulders for my doctoral exams. And for people who aren't in a PhD program now or have been, then they would know that there's these committees that you have to go sit in front of, and they grill you over hundreds and hundreds of books that you're supposed to have covered. And wow. I could hardly get out of bed, So it was just a crazy time. And so to avoid life, to avoid facing all of this, and to avoid the horrid pain of cracking another book of obscure French philosophy with terms like architectonic tautology and just things that rattle your brain, I was starting to play with cards and magic tricks, and I could focus on that. I could watch these videos. I didn't have to read a book or anything like that. Anyway, you don't get far in the world of card magic without coming across one of the holy grails, which is a memorized deck. And most people do some kind of trick that's not really memorized, but there's another class of people who actually memorize the deck, and there's a whole bunch of different techniques. And I thought, no way, this is crazy. And I thought, I'll never be able to do this because I can't even read. I can't even read Harry Potter, which is one of the books I had to read for a course where I was a teacher's assistant and barely able to get out of bed for that. And I apologize to all those students that I misdirected with showing up to class unprepared for Harry Potter. But in any case, I tried it, and it was incredible. And it's like a lightsaber through all that fog and all that inability to concentrate. And that's what really hooked me on memory techniques. Is it's irrelevant how bad you feel. It's irrelevant how tired you are. It's irrelevant how hungry you are. You can actually just go to this place in your mind and these images that you've created, and they are bulletproof so long as you've created them correctly. So that was real miraculous for me. And ever since then, just, it's actually helped with a lot of concentration issues and a lot of mental confusion, but those things are still there, and I still have to take medicine for them and so forth. But these memory skills, when used properly, just do not fail, regardless of what the mood may be or the condition. And so I just kept using them and studying, and I've done hundreds of hours of research, and then hundreds of hours, thousands of hours really, of application and figuring out the best ways that work. And then through a series of mysterious and unusual circumstances, I wound up teaching them at a school, and I wrote them down for the students, and that wound up becoming a series of books and video courses. And so that's how I got there.
Amazing. And I assume that things kind of turned around in the PhD program once you kind of learned how to use your memory and learned how to process all that material.
Yeah, it got kind of ridiculous, because then I was saying things like, oh, and by the way, that's on page 19. And I mean,
oh my gosh.
I think for everybody who gets into this stuff, there's always a little bit of showing off period. But nonetheless, it was incredible, because I would go to these things and just, be able to recall all this information and really crazy stuff. I mean, it's a funny story, but when I finally got to my dissertation defense, they call in a person from outside the university and outside the country if possible. And he's called the external, or she's called the external, which means they're external to the program and external to the university. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he came, and they were grilling me really, really hard, and they asked some tough questions. And there was someone who even wanted to fail me, and I knew she wanted to fail me really badly. And at the end, he said, you're cooler than Miles Davis. You hardly blinked during this whole thing at all the stress that these people were putting on you. And I didn't even know what to say. I didn't even really know that much about Miles Davis, but I just thought, it's memory, man. That's all it is. So
amazing.
There was nothing to be nervous about at all.
Amazing. And actually, your magnetic memory method rubbed off on me quite a bit. You were one of the people who convinced me to start using these kinds of techniques, these spatial awareness techniques, to put it into my course and to use it in my own daily life. But maybe our listeners don't know about the magnetic memory method. They might not be familiar with mnemonics, and you and I are kind of telling these awesome stories about them. Maybe we explain, what is the magnetic memory method? Explain a little bit about how it works.
Right. Well, there's a lot to it, and I don't want anybody to feel cheated if I kind of gloss over certain things, but it brings together a whole bunch of elements. But the core of it is to actually use locations religiously and make the memory palace the foundation of all this, because there are as many memory techniques as there are stairs to heaven in the Led Zeppelin song. There's just so many, right? But a lot of them involve just making mental associations and pictures, and they're just floating around in the void of your mind. That never worked for me very well. But what always worked very well was combining the basics of memory techniques, which are creating exaggerated images, and then locating them somewhere so that they could be found. And you essentially increase your chances the more that you combine location with these exaggerated images. But then I started to go farther, and I thought, what if we study this information in a particular way and break it down into components so that you could link sounds with parts of words and create images that are very, very integrally linked to those images and those actions that the images make. And then they're in those locations, and make it more and more powerful. And it got to like Jedi levels of thinking about this and actually implementing it and applying it. And it is a bit involved to learn, and it sounds almost insane. But for the people who use it, they get such amazing results. It's incredible. And I've just been super pleased that it wasn't just something in my head, but something that other people could use. But there's definitely a formula to it, and there's a recipe to it. And I specifically call it a method rather than a system, because there is a need for people to adapt it to their own sort of learning style and their own ways of going about things in their own homes, their own buildings that they're familiar with. So there's universal principles that structure it, but there's methodology that you need to adapt. It's kind of like the difference between kung fu or karate and wrestling. You have forms in karate, and you have certain if, then, this, that kind of interactions with your enemy. But wrestling is more flexible, and wrapping yourself around and innovating on the fly, and just there's not as many rules as such, but there's universal principles, just so long as you can flop around like a fish when you need to and get the job done. So Yeah.
Definitely. I'm actually dying of curiosity. How many memory palaces do you have? Can you quantify them? Are you in the hundreds or?
Yeah, there's now 183, actually. It was...
Oh, my goodness.
Last June was 175, and I've added to that since then for some various experiments. But there's a go-to amount as well. So, I mean, it builds some that never actually get used, but the actual building of memory palaces is an important activity in and of itself, even if you don't use them, because it just strengthens every other one you have. It strengthens your understanding of how they work and what you can do with them. And it's just a great way of preparing yourself. It's like having extra bullets in your belt, in your gun belt.
Of course. So you're kind of walking around your city or cities that you visit and exploring buildings with that purpose.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people ask me, they say, you have this idea that we should be having dozens of memory palaces. Where am I going to find them all? And I always just think, on my street, there's still places that I haven't explored. There's like a clinic that I could go into that I've never gone into. So if I really push came to shove, there's one. And that's not to mention the dozens of buildings on the streets around me that I've never really gone and exploited. But definitely, and every time I travel, I make special note of the hotels that I stay in because they're all perfect for their own little tiny memory palaces, admittedly, but they can be quite useful. And there's another good reason to use memory palaces that you build from travel, and that's because when we're in novel locations or new locations we've never been to, the brain secretes something called norepinephrine that makes things a lot more memorable when we have this chemical rolling around in our brain, which tends to happen when we're traveling. So those can become super powerful memory palaces if you choose to focus on them in that way.
Incredible. Plus the benefit of remembering more of your vacation, and that huge benefit.
Yeah, it kind of goes along with that feeling where you feel that you can really, really remember your first time in a city. And when you first arrived there, those first couple of days can be very, very impactful. And that has a lot to do with that chemical.
Incredible. So one of the important steps for me when I kind of became what I call a super learner was to understand the differences between working memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So now that we understand a little bit about how your method works, can you give us an idea of how you manage to create memories that stick not just in your short-term memory a month or two till you deliver your thesis, but for years and years and years?
Yeah, it's really quite simple. I mean, there's different theories and all kinds of things. And one of the guys who had theories that are half correct and half tested and debunked and still very interesting one way or the other is a guy named Hermann Ebbinghaus. But he had these ideas like the forgetting curve. And he basically suggested that there's something called the primacy effect, which is that if you were given a list of words, you would remember the first and second and third words very well, and then maybe the last 3 and 4 words very well, but in the middle there would be this decay. And I thought about that a lot and tested it, and it seems pretty well correct, but I thought there's got to be a way to hack this. And so if you had a memory palace, for example, and there were 15 stations, you would experience that primacy effect. But the way to hack it is to actually go forward through the memory palace, go back through the memory palace, start in the middle of the memory palace, go back to the front, start in the middle and go to the end, and then leapfrog over all those stations. And you do this about 5 times a day or for a few days. I mean, it sounds kind of weird to be doing this, but you know, how many times do you go to the washroom? And you could do this with a list of really, really important information. I mean, that's just to be bulletproof, but you can do a lot less, but that's just kind of the bulletproof thing if it really counts that you have this information. It's kind of like being a spaced repetition software machine organically, and not relying on external technology to do the repetition for you, but deciding what your list is or what kinds of information you're memorizing and actually visiting it intentionally. And that's what's going to get it into long-term memory. And Dominic O'Brien has the rule of 5, but I think the rule of 5 is not enough. It should be like a little bit more rigorous, 5 times a day for 5 days. And then after that, once a week for maybe 5 weeks and something like that. And then you're really going to get it into long-term memory.
Wow. So I know you have some very successful books on learning languages and poetry. And again, you've been providing me mentorship and guidance in publishing my own book. But what are some other applications that your students use the magnetic memory method for with success?
Oh, there's so much. For instance, programming languages. I know that basically is language, but the application is quite different in the sense that those are pretty obscure codes and whatnot. And then there's mathematical formulas and just practical things with numbers. A lot of people couldn't tell you what their credit card number is, for example. And that's an incredibly useful thing to know, actually. The amount of time you can spend looking for your wallet and digging it out and going back to the computer and typing it out and getting it wrong, you can really change your life just by having your credit card number and the amount of time you spend. And yeah, there's all kinds of things. There's people who have used some of the techniques that I teach in my Names and Faces course to memorize or get a better sense of locations that they visited so they can actually go and paint them. So that's been an interesting thing that I hadn't heard of before. And then there's just the general boost in critical and creative thinking that people experience because of how this opens them up to different ways of using their mind and their creative intelligence. So it spills out all over the place.
Definitely. Actually, that raises another question, especially talking about creativity. And I know some people think creativity is innate. Others kind of understand that it's very largely trained. But my question would be, can anyone do this? I have some strong opinions on it, considering I also teach accelerated learning. But I'm curious to hear whether you've seen a difference in some sort of innate ability in all the students you've worked with, or do some people just generally have a better memory out of the box?
I don't know if anybody has a better memory out of the box, but there seems to be that phenomenon. There seems to be that feeling. And I find that when you ask people who just have a quote-unquote natural memory, they usually describe a process that is very close to what happens in mnemonics. They just sort of do it anyway without having to train. But it isn't really the case that anybody has some special edge on other people, because the people who win all the memory championships, they're as dull as doorknobs without those techniques, And I mean, they're all great people, but they'll always be the first person to admit that, I don't know. I mean, I couldn't do this without those techniques. I'm just plumber or whatever they may be. So there's nothing particularly innate, but there is one kind of criteria, I believe, and that is actually wanting to achieve the outcome, and it seems being interested in doing the work and getting a kind of kick out of it. Because if you're not having fun, then I don't think all of the cheerleading in the world is going to get you over the hump of doing something that makes you miserable. And I don't understand why it would make anybody miserable, but some people just don't have fun with it, and I have to accept that. And I've done all kinds of clowning around and jokes and fun and games, and there's still people who don't enjoy doing it. So I think that that's really the great divide, is having fun or not having fun. And that applies to just about anything.
Definitely. One of the things that we added to our course was an explanation of Malcolm Gladwell's work. This guy in the 1950s basically figured out that there are 6 requirements for information to get in and stay in for an adult learner. And one of them is, it's, do they enjoy the material and do they have a practical application? Which is to say, a lot of kids in a younger age will learn because they're told they have to. And with adults, it just doesn't work that way. You need to know why you're learning it. You need to feel respected. You need to be able to tie it to your day-to-day life and understand how you're going to use it, or it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I think there's 2 real things that this reminds me of with adults and not having fun with the memory techniques, is because they don't always completely understand why thinking about crazy monkeys cutting cheese off of the Statue of Liberty is going to help them remember something. And they also often feel very compressed and restricted, and they don't allow their imaginations to produce that kind of imagery. So they can be quite conservative, and that is another sort of issue. But if they allow themselves to relax and have fun, then I think they'll find that their imaginations are much more equipped to create the kind of zany images that become memorable, that allow you to encode information in order to have this kind of fun. So
right.
It's not that they aren't fun. It's just that there's a lot of barriers to finding them as fun. So.
Right. And I think, honestly, your method added a lot of fun. You and I talked about it a little bit when I was a guest on your podcast, and it kind of influenced me. And since then, first off, I have a lot more fun. I'm personally learning Russian right now, which can be, to put it lightly, not very fun. But I'm having a lot more fun, and I can learn usually about 20 new words in a 20 or 30-minute session. And I use these really fun, outrageous visual markers that you gave me. For instance, the Russian word for open is odkryti. And I think about myself with a migraine standing in front of a closed pharmacy, just shaking my head in this absolute pain, or, I can picture myself with a bullet wound, heaven forbid, and thinking, the pharmacy ought to be open because it's critical, right? So ot kriti. And that's been really, really helpful. My question, and I have a little bit of a personal motive on this, what about learning grammar? I'm struggling quite a bit with Russian grammar, and I'm sure you've overcome this in the many languages you teach through your books.
Yeah, with the exception of English, I haven't produced anything specifically about memorizing grammar, but the principles are more or less the same. So basically, if you had a memory palace and you wanted to focus on some grammar, the first thing to do would be to figure out what grammar you want to focus on. So instead of being overwhelmed by the giant engines of grammar, you just pick one. So for instance, declensions of verbs or whatever. And then you start in one corner and you think about how that is declined for that particular piece of language. And you follow that linearly. So in Spanish, for example, you have yo for I, and then you have tú for you, and then you have él or ella for he or she, and you have all these things. And so you put those in corners, and then you add the next thing. So you know what I'm saying? Like you add what the next word part is. So if you get to ellos, which is the last of that list in Spanish, then you would see a big sun. So that would be ellos sun, right? Or to Eris, you would see a big statue of Ares in that location.
Oh, interesting.
Doing something really, really crazy. Things like that. And it's just, and I'm just going to my own memory palaces for that. And so then you go to the next set of principles, and you go to the next set of principles, and you just lay them out. In essence, you make images that create the examples, and you create a kind of crib sheet. And then what you do is you go out ASAP once you've got the stuff in your memory, and you start writing sentences, and you start speaking, and you start listening to the language every day, and you add that memorized material to a flow of other encounters. Because the more that you include the memory techniques and the memorization process with reading, writing, speaking, and listening, then you create an ecosystem, and things can get very, very fast after that.
Right. I definitely need to do that. I hadn't thought of actually breaking down the connecting words and stuff like that. And, in Russian, you have, I think it's 18 different ways to say this, which can be very challenging. So I need to start creating these visual images for each one of those different variants, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would do. And I would have them patterned out against a memory palace, and then do that exact thing, forward, backwards, from the middle to the front, from the middle to the back, and then a bit of leapfrogging from station to station, like 1, 3, 5, 7 or 2, 4, 6, 8. And you'll really get a lot of speed and quick, rapid into midterm and long-term memory acquisition. And then again, reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Because you can use all the memory techniques in the world, but it's not going to lead to fluency without those other big 4 activities.
Definitely.
And really, why that I came up with this is because I'm pretty good at those other 4 activities. The only problem is I can't remember a damn thing. So it's really been the magic bullet, so to speak. I mean, it's a magic bullet that takes effort to take it out of your gun belt and put it in the gun and roll the chamber and point it at the target and shoot the gun. That's all effort and so forth. But once that bullet is spinning, I mean, it's as magical as it gets.
Right. Right. I had a little bit of a kind of not argument, but disagreement with my partners when we were building our course, because I'm of the belief that people need to understand how it works, and people should understand just a little bit of the neuroscience behind mnemonics and how do they work? Why does your brain respond to this stuff? Do you think that that's the case? Or do you think that it's something like with a good technology product where the confusion and the technicalities should be hidden from the end user?
Well, I had the great honor to interview Harry Lorraine, who people probably know that name. He's really one of the kings of the memory training world. And I asked him the same question. I said, you talk in your books all the time about how people don't care about the science. They just want to know how it works. And I tend to fall on that myself, although I've had criticism from a podcast listener who said that I have deeply undercut my credibility because of how I dismiss science and the science of memory. But that's not technically true. And it's also because I do kind of fall in that camp that if you're interested in the science, by all means, go and study it. But it is in and of itself not the recipe to get results. So, I mean, there's no right answer to it, but I know for myself, when I'm reading books and I start getting into memory books and then they start explaining to me about why it all works and how it all works in the brain, I just skip over it, because the one thing that's very important, actually, for people to know is that science is a process. It's in process. Everything that you read about science is going to be improved upon. It's going to be changed. But what's not going to be changed are the fundamental techniques of how memory skills work. They're ancient. There's innovations that come now and again when somebody comes up with things that other people can copy and use for themselves. They're pretty rare, but they happen. But in principle, those universal techniques are not going to change. So again, I don't mean to undercut science, but I still fall in that camp that if you're interested in it, there's loads of books about it. But if you want to get the results from memory techniques, the science isn't going to change the fundamental techniques, and they're not really going to give you some deep insight about how they work. What's going to give you insight about how they work is learning them and using them. And you're going to learn more from using them than you are about reading them. So there's more to movement than meditation, and reading about the science is a form of meditation rather than taking action.
Interesting. Yeah. You mentioned that there are innovations every year in these techniques, and I think that's one of the interesting things. Also, you mentioned that, these are 1,000-year-old techniques, and both of those are topics that come up in Joshua Foer's recent book, Moonwalking with Einstein. I think that's an interesting book because it's really brought to the mass public the techniques that you've been teaching for years, or that, the Greeks were using 2,000 years ago. What do you think about the recent popularity of guys like Josh Foer or Ed Cook, some of these memory athletes who are winning champions and stuff like that?
Well, I think it's fantastic. There's absolutely nothing to criticize. Although, with Moonwalking with Einstein, if you go and read the reviews, a lot of people are disappointed that he doesn't actually teach the techniques. He sort of glosses over them, but it's really a book of cultural history and this phenomenon of what is sort of an underworld. Not that many people know about memory championships and so forth. So it's a really, really interesting book, and it's brought a lot of attention to these ancient techniques. Ed Cook also with Memorize and the things that he does. And there's a really great interview with him recently on Tim Ferriss's podcast that I highly recommend people listen to. At least the first hour. After that, they kind of get drunk. But
they end up in the woods, as that podcast often does. But it's really enjoyable how Ed kind of walks through and he tricks Tim into memorizing this list of really ridiculous stuff.
That gets back to the thing about having fun. You really got to trick yourself into doing it, because then you see how much fun it is and you get hooked and things really change for you. But I think that really what comes down to a lot of these people, and not Foer or Cook in particular, but the whole world that has been around for a long time and is just growing and growing, is that a lot of people use the word system. And there are no systems. There's just methods that allow you to create your own system. And I think that things would be a lot easier for people if more of these big names in memory would make that clear. So that's really, really important. Yeah, I mean, it's just been this kind of idea of it being a system since Giordano Bruno did his stuff in the 16th century. Well, I don't know if people are aware of him, but he had these really complicated books that he wrote for royalty, and, well, or at least so that they would fund the printing of the books. They were always dedicated to royalty. And yeah, he just created these massive systems, but he just says, use these instead of here's the principles behind how that I've used these, so that you can map at your own learning style and your own interests and your own homes on top of them. And so that's really what a lot of these books have been about. They've been about how the other person used them, but not extracting the methodology behind it and making that as clear as possible. So,
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the actual nuts and bolts are much more obscure. I mean, down to like the nitty-gritty things, like what kind of loci or locations or anchor points are better than others. Am I supposed to be storing my memories on a bookshelf, or can I put, a couple memories on a bed? It's like the really nitty-gritty details of, okay, great, I've built my memory palace. How do I actually use this thing, and what do I put in it and where?
Yeah, that's basically been the core of my success because I go into all of that stuff in detail. I've written more than 1,000 pages just with those specifics about, can you use a bed? Can you use under your bed? Can you go underneath the sheets? I mean, every possibility I've gone through one way or the other. And yet at the same time, hardly a month goes by when someone doesn't email me with some new application that they're using that I never thought of before. So it's pretty
interesting,
pretty crazy.
I'd actually be very fascinated. I assume our audience would be as well. Can you walk me through maybe one of the first sentences you learned in another language and tell me what words are where, out of curiosity?
Sentences in another language. Okay. That's interesting because I actually don't normally memorize sentences, just vocabulary. And then because I know the grammar, then it's not really that I memorize phrases. I'm more focusing on vocabulary. So nothing leaps to mind, but I can give something in English because memorizing poetry is more where I would use that. And I'll explain exactly how it works. So there's a famous little book called the Iliad by some guy named Homer. And it says, this is a particular translation. This is Dryden's translation. There's others that you'll come across if what I'm about to say doesn't quite match what you've come across. And it says, of Peleus' son Achilles, sing, O Muse, the vengeance deep and deadly, whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose. And that's really the first, it's not even the first sentence, but it's the first major statement. And to do this, I created a memory palace, and actually I was memorizing it to demonstrate to a coaching client I had exactly how this could be done, and I used her school because she had a school. She still has a school. So I used the coffee room where coffee is made, and then beside that there's a wall that has a painting, and then there's an office that I sometimes worked in myself, and then there was a classroom, and that's all that was needed for this particular thing. So you want me to go through, unpack that, how that works? Or
Sure, if you don't mind. I find it very fascinating.
Okay, so here's where I have to actually press my memory because you don't really need the training wheels after a while. But basically what I saw was Brad Pitt, who played Achilles in the movie Troy, and he's kicking a pail. So Peleus' son Achilles, sing, O Muse. He's kicking the pail at the Statue of Liberty, who's singing, and she gets hit in the head by this pail, which makes her feel vengeant, and she's also at the same time digging in the dirt, the vengeance deep and deadly, and throwing it at a map of Greece that has replaced this painting that's on the wall in this school. So whence to Greece, and then I'm standing at this office door wiping away numbers on the chalkboard, whence to Greece unnumbered ills arose. And you might notice that I'm not accounting for every single word in that line, but just enough. And that's an important question that a lot of people have. Do I have to have an image for every single word? And the answer is no. You just need to have enough that you want to honor your mind and let it fill in the blanks. You say potato, I say potato, right? Like you can fill in the blanks, and your mind has that kind of ability. So you give it space. But as beginners, you might want to do word for word. But it's really just a simple image. Brad Pitt kicking a pail at the Statue of Liberty, who's digging in the earth, throwing the dirt at a map, and I'm wiping away numbers.
So I've noticed you compressed those symbols. We talk a little bit about this in my course, where you want to create linkages between them. So it's not a statue of Brad Pitt and then a statue of a pail, but rather Brad Pitt kicking the pail. And that's in one location in your memory palace.
Yeah, the real secret to it is that it's a vignette that's strung along a journey, and it has space in it. So a lot of people will try to do that same thing inside of a single room or inside of a single image, as you're suggesting. But I think that the fluidity comes from giving it space. And obviously the entire Iliad would require a lot more space than this one school would offer. But that's just how it works. And if you wanted to, then you could find all that space to do the entire Iliad. And people do. It's not unusual, actually.
Right.
When you look into it, there's all kinds of people walking around with entire books in their head.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting that you said "and people do" about the Iliad, because people did. And one of the things I found so fascinating about Foer's book is he talks about some researchers who figured out that most of Homer's works were written and reproduced for so many years with memory palaces. Just by the structure of the text, they were able to figure out that, you wouldn't really write it this way unless someone was trying to convert it to a visual symbol. And the story wouldn't kind of double back on itself if it wasn't being, somewhere along the way, someone crossed their own memory journey. And I think it's just so fascinating because these books are known for being huge, volumes and very, very long works that actually were committed for thousands of years to memory.
Well, sure. There was only eating, drinking, going to war, and memorizing.
Right.
That's all they had. Or
pretty much
reciting what they memorized. But
it's amazing. It's amazing as a species what we did before we had these tools, that in a lot of ways help us, but in a lot of ways, who even knows any of their friends' phone numbers anymore, much less credit card numbers or anything like that. When I was a kid, I knew all my friends' phone numbers, and then cell phones came out. So slowly but surely, we've completely obliterated the skill of memory as a species and as a culture, which is just a shame.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, what's so interesting to me is that it's at the same moment that we appear to be eradicating our memories through technology that memory techniques have basically come into a renaissance.
Right.
So it's almost like the tidal wave has built the ship that will save you from the storm.
Right. Well, and also in Homer's time, someone was very, very lucky to come across 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 such stories. The entirety of mythology and stuff like that was just about everything they were learning. Whereas today, I try to read 2 books a month, and I try to read 10 blog posts and articles a day. And so we don't digest and redigest and reprocess the material. We're really going for breadth more than depth.
Yeah, that's true. There was always a saying when I was a student that you're better off mastering 1 book than knowing 1,000. And to the extent that that's a bit exaggerated, but there is that question that I often think about when I read certain things is so much of what I'm reading is either ignorant of or grounded in things that I already know from having a more traditional training. And that does come from knowing a few books really, really well rather than 1,000 not so well at all, if you know what I mean.
Actually, that raises another question, if I can kind of dig a little deeper into the magnetic memory method. That I think there's 2 ways to organize. Say I do a lot of reading about programming and technology in general, and I could organize it by, here's a book that I read, and every single book gets its own palace, or I could be grouping, right? So any blog post I read goes into a palace about Ruby on Rails if it happens to touch on that, just as an example. So do you group information book by book in its own palace, or do you kind of take subjects and put them into their own palaces, and many sources can feed one palace?
Well, it really depends on what's going on. When I was studying for my dissertation defense, for example, I made memory palaces per philosopher. And it wasn't as if, Jacques Derrida would mention Foucault or vice versa, that I would somehow, have to have this big confusion of what I was going to do. It's just that they kept independent based on who they were and that person. And incidentally, those memory palaces had what I call a bridging figure, and those bridging figures would be those philosophers and just sort of follow them around through their adventures and to be able to recall this stuff. But in terms of like branching out and having tunnels between this and that, I don't deliberately build that because it builds itself anyway.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It becomes what I call rhizomatic, which a lot of knowledge and education is taught in a top-down tree structure. So you go from the branches down through the trunk into the roots. But a rhizome is something that's more beneath the earth and spreads out laterally and can even pop up new bulbs in ways that don't even seem connected to the original plant. And so it can go up, down, left, right, and center, diagonal, and all kinds of different permutations can just pop out of anywhere. But I think that that's best produced by having a kind of a grid that you don't deliberately try to interweave too much, other than you interweave it based on your understanding of the world around you, using those buildings that you know to deliberately create well-structured journeys and memorize stuff there. And the actual connections will happen on their own.
Right. That's super interesting. Have you ever made a list on pen and paper or on the computer of your 183 memory palaces and what they contain, or is that complete blasphemy?
Well, again, that depends on what the project is, and it's not blasphemy, it's insurance.
Right.
And it's
right.
and it's actually the best thing to do because you're getting multiple modalities going at the same time. So basically, you asked me before about midterm and long-term memory, and this is basically one really great way to use paper and pen or your computer in combination with these techniques. So let's say you got a list of 50 words that you want to memorize, and you have a 50-station memory palace, and you actually have that memory palace in your mind, and you have it as an Excel file. So 1 to 50, and it lists the station, and then it lists the word that you've memorized, and another column lists the meaning of the word, or one or two meanings. You don't want to overburden it at first. You can go back and add later. And then the next column has the record of the image that you created. So as you're going along, making your associative imagery, you make a record of it. You can do it on pen or with a paper, or you can do it with an Excel file. And then you're going to go and remove yourself from that source material. No books, no dictionaries, no computer, nothing. Just you, a piece of paper, and a writing device, pen or pencil. And then you reproduce everything from your mind, and you go and check it against the record. And that's the full bore method here. And again, you can do this with the forward and back and from the middle to the end and all those different ways that I was talking about, but do it on paper completely from your mind, and you're achieving multiple things at the same time. You're deepening your knowledge of your memory palaces and your memory techniques. You're deepening your knowledge of what it is that you're studying. You're deepening your ability to use imagination and imagery and actions, and you're deepening your discipline to actually sit and be able to reproduce information from your mind. And then you're rewarding yourself by going back to that list and seeing, oh my goodness, this is 90% correct, 98% correct, 88% correct. And it's just gives you the basis to make corrections and go back and say, well, Batman hitting a cat with toast is really not working, so I got to make that cat a battle tiger or whatever. And you can make corrections, and that again makes you more imaginative.
Right.
And it gives you more exposure to what it is that you're trying to memorize. So it's just a completely different way of approaching information and working with information that's fun and exciting and more interesting than just trying to hammer it into your head with pure raw repetition.
Sure. Yeah, I think you've inspired me. I've been working on Russian with the tips you gave me last time, but I think I'm going to try and commit it to actual physical locations in a memory palace. The only issue is Pushkin, who the Russians love to admire, and they have this saying that Pushkin is our everything, right? Their language is what they're most proud of in their culture. The guy knew 50,000 words, which is why there's a lot of rumors about him, similar to there were about Shakespeare, that, you know, there could not have been one person writing this work. So I'm going to need to really start accumulating quite a bit of memory palaces, you know, maybe one for words that start with O and one for words that start with P, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, a lot of people think that I'm pretty crazy for suggesting that, but the benefit of doing that is that you don't have to learn 50,000 words, because when you're using an alphabetized memory palace system, you're actually studying how the language works itself in a much more detailed way, to the point that you can just start guessing what words mean. And you're not going to be right all the time, but your familiarity with the structure of words and how that they're patterned out develops really in this rhizomatic way that I was suggesting.
Right.
So you can read quite easily. And, you know, we do it in our own mother tongue anyway. We read and we go, what does that word mean again? Or I never heard that word. But you get the context and you just keep going, or you make note of it and check it out later. And so, I mean, 50,000 words in Russian would be absolutely fantastic. But whether it's a requirement to understand Pushkin, I don't know.
I'd be happy with 10,000 words at this point. And the words, like I said, are only a very small part of the challenge of such a complex language.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in the beginning of the podcast memorizing cards, and I happened to pick up as I was doing my research for this podcast, you actually just released a new course on Udemy on memorizing cards. Tell me a bit about that. I've never actually had the motivation to do it myself. I know how it's done and some of the latest techniques in compressing, but maybe, you know, explain why someone would want to learn that skill, why it might appeal.
Well, there's lots of reasons why. I mean, it's one of those things, again, where it just sounds absolutely crazy. Why would anybody want to do this? But there's...
Unless they're going to Vegas, in which case, you know, if you can memorize 4 decks of cards in order, you might be in pretty good shape.
You'd certainly give yourself a small advantage, like maybe 1% to 2% advantage, but especially if you can do a number calculation system as well, like with blackjack. But the thing is that Well, I mean, I just gave that example from the Iliad, right? And I talked about having space in between things. And one of the things that really makes my card memories method rather than a system is unique is that it teaches you to create that space between things. And it's not necessarily the fastest way to memorize cards, and I don't teach it as a speed drill as such, although you will get faster. I teach it as a creativity drill and getting better at using locations in combination with images. So if you're interested in memory techniques, that's one thing that it will help you do is you can apply these card drills to everything else that you want to memorize. And it's something that you can do for 5 minutes before you memorize foreign language vocabulary just to get the mind warm. And there's other benefits too, just in terms of being something that you can carry around with you to practice, and you can get apps for it as well. And you're just studying how your mind's working, and you're thinking about your creative imagination, and you're applying your creative imagination. And there's also something to the repetitiveness of it. So it's kind of like running, where you get to a jogger's high. You train yourself to feel that, and you can apply that feeling to other things.
Fascinating. So it's really a very good way to practice the entire methodology in a standardized way. I mean, every deck of cards, a standardized deck of cards looks the same, has the same characters. And so people all over the world, I guess, are practicing this skill. And it's a great way to develop subsets of that skill that can be then applied to memorizing credit cards and phone numbers. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and the other thing that's neat about it is that it's a real nice combination of concrete and abstract things. And that's a really great thing to have mastery of, especially if you're going to learn foreign language vocabulary and grammar principles, is this kind of, you recognize it, you know what letters are, you know what sounds are. Those are the concrete parts. And yet what their meaning is completely abstract. So what's the meaning of 7 of diamonds? Nothing. But you learn to apply meaning to it because you create it through a process into an image. And by taking things that are largely abstract and applying imagery to them, you get very, very good, very fast at applying that to anything else.
Right. And any new piece of knowledge, especially with foreign languages, for example, you start out with something like the 7 of Hearts that means nothing right now and needs to soon mean something very real and tangible and memorable to you. So I can definitely see how applying that and learning to apply that would have huge repercussions, positive repercussions for anything you want to learn.
Yeah. And the way I teach it is actually quite different than most people teach it. So definitely explore other things. And if you do listen to that Ed Cook interview and see some of his videos on YouTube, he has a completely different way of doing it. And mine is less arbitrary. So if you are into that kind of way that he approaches it, or the Dominique method of approaching it, that's totally fine. But there's a way that's much less arbitrary and based more snugly on principles that can reduce some of that arbitrariness.
Very cool. So I really enjoyed it, actually. Last time I listened to your podcast, it happened to be an episode where you shared a message that you had from a student who was really impacted by your methods. And I found that, A, to be a really great thing to include in a podcast, but B, super inspirational. Do you have any recent stories that you've gotten or recent messages that you might want to share about some student success?
Yeah, I mean, almost every day something comes, but there was a student who was really stressed out about the exams that he had coming up, and it was actually really, really nice because he'd never even bought anything yet, but just sort of cobbled everything together from my podcast. And he thanked me and he said, I got 98% on this test, and it was just unbelievable. And then he bought my masterclass, which is not on Udemy, but its own separate thing. And it was just kind of like this big thank you because of the results that he got from the magnetic memory method. And yeah, there's people all around the world. I heard from a guy in Italy who's just super happy that he's making so much progress with the dictionary and that he got. And I suggested that he look at a particular kind of dictionary that he was able to find. And it's just incredible. I heard from a law student today who's working on Latin in order to get a better understanding of the law. And he's doing really great. And he's even teaching this approach at school now. And the dean has invited him to give a presentation about it.
Wow.
And so it's just really spreading like wildfire. And this particular approach, which is great. I'm very happy that if it just even gets interest in memory techniques in and of itself, because that, to me, that's really the most important thing is that people just start to see the magic and the power of this and just do something, because there's so much suffering in the world that has to do with memory, and there's so much opportunity that's lost because people can't achieve their goals without it. And there's just, that suffering is simply not necessary.
Definitely. I also struggled a great deal through high school, and to a larger extent, when a lot of the memory stuff was happening was when I was a lot younger. And, I just suffered and suffered through history class and through math class, and largely because of memory. And there's no real teaching of this in academia, which I just find mind-boggling. Like, nobody ever stopped to explain to me that I needed to create visual memories. Not until after college. And I was lucky to run into someone like yourself, who was an expert. And I tell that whole story kind of in my courses. But I just think, what if I'd never encountered this and I went through my entire life thinking that there was this huge barrier to learning? Today I'm learning how to podcast, and I'm learning how to blog, and I'm learning all this kind of different stuff that it doesn't faze me at all to approach a new language in my free time, because learning has become this fun, friction-free process. And I just think, what a shame that people think they have to suffer to learn.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's all kinds of theories about why schools exist in the first place, but we don't necessarily have to get into that. But for anybody who's suffering with school, know that there's light at the end of the tunnel, and
Definitely.
You can start using these things now to make your school experience a whole lot more enjoyable if you're still somewhere in the middle of the road.
Definitely. And it becomes, I've also heard from a number of my students, if you're dealing in a traditional academic setting where, concessions are made for the fact that learning is very hard for people who do it wrong, to kind of be not politically correct. But once you start using these kind of techniques, the kind that you and I both teach, it becomes like fishing with dynamite. These 98% test results are pretty common among people who know how to apply the proper methods. And I just think that's so much fun that you probably have students all over the world who are setting the curve and really angering their classmates. And it's simple stuff that's accessible online and, takes a little bit of training.
Yeah, well, I think that thing about angering their fellow classmates, one thing that I always try to do in just about every message I send is, if you've learned something from this, pass it on, because two things happen. You get better at them because something taught is something learned twice.
Of course.
You also get to help those other people. There's no competition in the world. People who are all tied up in competition are really just hurting themselves. So it's just an important thing to...
Of course. And all in good fun, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. But fishing with dynamite is a great metaphor. And I think that's also raises the important thing that you and I as teachers, and if you do take up these skills, becoming a teacher of them, is that we really need people who know how to fish and aren't waiting for fish to land in their boat. And so that's really been my great passion, and in how I approach teaching in terms of showing how it's done rather than giving lots of examples of how to do it.
Definitely. And that is without a doubt one of the most rewarding, if not the most rewarding part of teaching, is forget the ego boost, forget all that stuff. It's when you get an email from a kid who has been seeing a psychiatrist for years and years about severe ADD and stuff like that, and all of a sudden gets to stop seeing that psychiatrist. The psychiatrist cuts him back to once every 2-month meetings because, hey, you're getting 90% on all your exams and you're not having suicidal thoughts before every exam. That's a really, really impactful thing. So what's next for you, if you don't mind sharing? What are you working on?
Well, I'm about to release a book on sleeping.
Really? That's actually another topic you and I share a lot of interest in. Do tell.
Well, it's probably one of the more unique books on sleeping that's out there. I've certainly never encountered anything like this, and I've been using it for years. And so the book, and it'll eventually be a video course, is called The Ultimate Sleep Remedy: How to Fall Asleep Anytime and Any Place with Ease, the life-changing, no-nonsense, rapid results guide to getting a better rest and more sanity in your waking life, which is one of these great long titles. But
yeah, I was going to say, do you have a memory palace to remember the title when people ask you at a cocktail party?
Well, you have to when you write titles that long. But yeah, basically, one of the things about a lot of sleep remedy books and trainings and stuff like that is that they tell you that you shouldn't stay in bed if you can't sleep, and go out of bed until that you feel tired and then go back to bed. And that's something that I found is true to a certain extent, but there's a better way. And I talk about that. And then the other thing is that there are all kinds of sleep rituals. So brush your teeth at the same time and go to the bathroom 2 hours before you sleep or whatever. And we're not robots. Nobody is going to brush their teeth at the same time every night. What we need is the ability to lay down in bed and fall asleep. So what I teach is being comfortable laying in bed, no matter how painful it is to sit there and not be able to sleep, and learn to be comfortable in that situation. And that's the true path to sleeping at will, basically, is to just think about sleep completely differently and think about lying in bed differently. So I wrote a whole book about it.
Amazing. I have two questions on that. The first is, do you think you can teach me to fall asleep sitting up? Because I'm one of these guys, if I'm not laying on either my stomach or my side, it's not going to happen, which makes long haul flights absolutely miserable.
Well, yeah, I think that this would work for sitting up. And I've sort of used it that way in terms of just being generally relaxed, but not as a sleep remedy. But I'm sure that it will address that need as well.
My second question, and you've already sold me, so that's that. But my second question, are you a believer in biphasic or polyphasic sleep?
I don't know that much about it, and I've done some reading about it and experiments and so forth. But again, it's kind of one of these things where I'm personally not such a person that has such rhythms. And to even try and get on the surfboard, let alone ride the wave, is just going to be not something that I would gladly, happily do. And just the rhythms of my day don't respond to it. And so it would just be a losing battle to do that kind of life hacking.
Right. I've actually found, specifically in grad school, I found that the nap worked really well, but anything above that, getting into the 2, 3, 4 naps a day just completely wreaked havoc on my lifestyle. So I thought I'd ask if you similarly had experimented with it.
Well, I certainly have used napping, but there's a moment in napping where your brain will start to secrete chemicals, not gremlins, but chemicals, I think I was about to say. It will start to secrete these chemicals that put you into the position of longer term sleeping. And so that's why you often feel hungover and worse off than when you went to sleep. And so I think that meditation has always worked better for me. But again,
you read my mind.
But again, it's not like with a clock, ding, ding, time to meditate or anything like that. I think that the real power with meditation is actually to meditate all the time. It's like nonstop shopping, You just develop a kind of awareness. And of course, that awareness is broken, but you can get it longer and longer and longer and become more conscious and aware for greater lengths of time, and then combine that with sitting. But I always loved Alan Watts' idea of sitting just to sit, and as being the ultimate meditation.
Right. When you say sit, I mean, a lot of meditation enthusiasts use the term sit, and they actually mean sit for Vipassana meditation. I get the sense you mean just sit quietly, eyes open kind of thing, or?
Yeah, because basically what happens if you sit just to sit, then you're going to fall into those other sort of techniques and strategies anyway. You're going to sit there and you're going to be aware eventually that you're just sitting there, and then you'll start to laugh or whatever, and you'll come into basically quote unquote enlightenment. I mean, enlightenment is only 5 minutes away. It's just sitting just to sit and just wait for something to happen. Don't move until something happens, and you'll know enlightenment very quickly. So at least that's my feeling. And I mean, I've developed it to a certain thing, but I love these moments where I'm just walking around the streets. I went shopping or whatever, and I suddenly catch myself not present at all, and I just start to laugh because it's just the most hilarious thing to be mindless. And it's the most common thing on the planet as well, right? I think the vast majority of people, just by the way we live our lives, we spend a lot of our time, even once we're aware of presence and mindfulness, we spend the vast majority of our time caught up in a lot of minutia that pulls us out of kind of our present state. Yeah, and there's no one who's free from it, but there are varying degrees of freedom, and it's definitely worth cultivating because it can really change your life in some very powerful ways. Oh, yeah. And your brain, which I think is really interesting. And they're starting to do a lot more research. I have my ticklers that send me whenever there's new research about this, but they're really starting to understand the neurological changes caused by meditation and presence, and even stuff like positive affirmations are literally changing the mechanical structure of your brain. And I think that for anyone who's taking
antidepressant medication or attention deficit medication, that's a really exciting prospect. Like I can sit for 20 minutes a day and I can change my neurochemistry for free. That's got to be one of the most exciting things happening in science to me.
Yeah, it's actually pretty amazing because you can get free opium and all you have to do is sit for 20 minutes to get it, or even shorter periods of time. And that's
right, without the withdrawal.
Yeah. In fact, it's totally without the withdrawal. It has the opposite effect. It's give me more drawl or whatever.
Yeah. Do you sit, and when I say sit, I mean meditate, eyes closed, focus on breathing kind of thing. Do you sit every day?
Yeah, but I do all kinds of things. So I will sit. One of the most powerful meditations that I ever learned was the corner exercise, which is just to find the corner of something and look at it, and then start to be able to look at the space around it and see that air is really a kind of jello that's pushing against everything, and that object is pushing against the jello. And it's just kind of a neat way to blend yourself into presence in the room and think about that air pressing upon you as a kind of like really a jello. It's an object, air, in and of itself, or an object filled with many objects. So I'll do that. And I also do certain kinds of breathing when I feel like it or I don't. And I really like something called psychic nostril breathing, which is without using your finger to hold down a nostril, you just imagine that air is coming up your left nostril and out your right nostril, and then up your right nostril and out the left nostril, and you just sort of cycle that. And then you can combine that with something called pendulum breathing. And pendulum breathing is breathing in, then breathing in again, then breathing out, and breathing out again. And you swing your breath that way. And you combine those two things together. It's a little bit like syncopated drumming. But once you get used to it, this is just an incredible thing in and of itself. And you don't do it for any kind of end goal. You do it just to do it while you're sitting, just to sit. And the most incredible things happen.
Right. I think that's really cool because a lot of beginners, myself included, start with a very common Vipassana practice, and you're supposed to sit there and just focus on your breathing, and inevitably your breathing is not very interesting. So I like the idea of making it a little bit more interesting. Sometimes my breathing won't captivate my attention, so I'll listen to or feel my heart rate, but I'll definitely try that out in twice and then out twice.
What do you think about combining meditation with technology?
I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, you have this very pure, beautiful practice that's estimated to be about 5,000 years old, right? So in a lot of ways, it shares that characteristic with the memory palace, right? You don't need a technological innovation to use a memory palace. It's something that we as humans have kind of inherited down from ancestry. And I think there's beauty in that. On the other hand, I think it's an amazing way to connect to millions of people. And if you look at an app like Headspace or Calm, these apps are all over the news and they're raising awareness and they're creating what some people call the mindfulness revolution. And I think that's great. And I personally got into meditation because someone told me to try out Headspace, and I tried their 10-day trial, at which point I decided that, no matter how lovely Dr. Andy's accent was, I'd probably be better off, with just some noise isolating headphones. But I will tell you one piece of technology that I've been very excited and very disappointed by is kind of home ECG. So I have this headband sitting here that's supposed to measure my brain waves and tell me, how I'm doing and help me understand the changes in my brain. How are my alpha waves changing? How are my delta waves changing over time? And I think that's really motivating and really exciting. The technology is definitely not there yet, and I'm looking forward to a time when it will be there. But I don't know. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I'm not that big of a fan either, but there is some benefit to it sometimes. So I really like an app called Still Point, which plays 3 different kinds of sounds and you can mix them. So you have like a bass line, not a bass guitar line, but a bass line sound, and then you can add like some sort of heartbeat or something like that, and then you can add a periodic ohm or a periodic toodaloo or whatever. You got different options. And when my mind is really sped up, sometimes I will go to that because it's just really pleasant to listen to and really does provide a point of focus that I may not be able to give for myself. So that's been
interesting. Cool. Is it a little bit like binaural beats?
Yeah, except for without the binaural stuff. I mean, I don't know. To tell you the truth, I didn't memorize the packaging when I got it, but it really struck me as being quite interesting because it wasn't really in that sort of fringe of science. And I'm not that studied in what research they've done, but it was just kind of like, this is just sounds that you can put together to help you focus, and no real claims above that or beyond it. But you reminded me something when you mentioned 4,000 years of meditation. And a lot of people think that the memory palace technique came from ancient Greece. But the reality is that it did, except for it also came from the ancient East. And a lot of the Buddhist meditations used location-based memorization. So
really?
Yeah, for example, I learned a meditation one time and I thought, man, this is a memory palace. And I mean, it's one of those specific meditations where you're not just sitting to sit, but you're actually doing stuff. And the teacher said, imagine that you're in this temple and at this particular location, there's a bridge. And as you walk across the bridge, you see all these people at the bottom of the bridge, and they are throwing stones at you, trying to make you fall down. And at the other end of the bridge, you are at a party, and everybody is cheering you on and offering you food and wine. And then over at this corner of the temple, imagine this big black dog, and that dog is always chasing you, and that is the representation of death. And then it went on. And I remember this because I'm going through my mind right now thinking of all these things. And this is 10 years ago that I learned this meditation. And so all of these things represent stuff, like the people throwing rocks at you or reminding you to remember all of the people you dislike or that you consider as enemies, and forgive them. And the people at the party are also your friends, but you forgive them because they're trying to poison you with all their good stuff or whatever, you know. And the dog is death, literally always behind you. And you practice the meditation of realizing that death is coming. And so it's a memory palace, basically.
Fascinating.
And that meditation is thousands of years old.
Huh. Amazing. So, Anthony, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're quite a prolific man, and you very much lived up to your Miles Davis nickname from your PhD dissertation. I know you're doing books, you're doing podcasts, Udemy courses. You also have a master course that apparently I really need to check out. If listeners want to learn more about you or maybe start training in the magnetic memory method, where do they start finding all this different material?
Well, what I'd like to really do is give listeners to your podcast some worksheets and a free video series, which you can find at magneticmemorymethod.com/becoming superhuman.
Awesome. That would be perfect. I know there's so much different stuff that you've put out there, and, you know, thousands of pages on whether or not I should be storing Brad Pitt in my bed that I would love to speed read through. So I'm actually going to check that link out myself.
Yeah, you just got to decide above the sheets, below the sheets. Or wrap
I think it depends if it's a female listener or a male listener.
Yeah, but anyway, for people who are listening to this and are really interested, there's worksheets, there's videos that'll make it a lot more concrete, and you can see what's going on. So that's magneticmemorymethod.com/becoming superhuman.
Awesome. And we're going to put up notes to all the different resources, some of which I'm going to research myself, different links we've talked about, books, stuff like that. It'll all be up on our website.
Cool.
So awesome. Anthony, thanks so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure, as always, chatting with you.
Well, thank you, and keep up all the good work, and I can't wait for the next time.
Awesome. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.